Hi, and welcome to Negotiate Value Lesson 5. As we wrap up Module 1 here, we're going to go head first into one of the most prevalent and effective negotiation tactics that is used in the marketplace today, and that is anchoring. The power of anchoring is absolutely huge. It's hard to overstate, and I'm going to give a couple of stories toward the end of this about the Beatles and about J.C. Penney's that will illustrate the power of anchoring. Everything we've talked about so far really fits into how we're going to approach this. So let's do a quick review of the first module, what we covered in the lessons, and then tie that into how we're going to attack anchoring and then move forward for the rest of the course. So the first week, we talked about these twin skills of buying and negotiation, how they're very much overlapping, and we can study them both and improve at both of them at the same time, which is extremely important and useful to us because you are a professional buyer. The skill of buying that you have, the skill of negotiation, has an amazing impact on your life, on your money, and on your time, so you want to work on those skills. Now, in the second week, we talked about seeing the surplus of a transaction from the buyer's perspective, and that means defining the benefit, right? The top end, what's above the price, and how the difference between your benefit and the price is the value that you take as the buyer. In the third week, we looked at the surplus, but from the seller's perspective, and evaluated the cost components that go into the sale that sellers make. And we wrapped it all together in the fourth week and looked at transactions in general. We sort of gauged them and judged them, said, hey, where's the value in this transaction? Is it a purchase with a lot of surplus or just a little bit of surplus? And does it go to the buyer or to the seller or to both or to neither? How do we judge this transaction? So that's what we've done so far in a nutshell, and there are a few key lessons that we want to reinforce. The first big idea is you are a professional buyer. The second one is we buy for value, not price. The difference between the price and the benefit, not the price alone. So because we do that, it's so key to understand the benefit components and the cost components, because that's what then determines the value for the buyer and the seller. And then finally, different purchases have different levels of surplus, and it's distributed in different ways. So you need to be able to judge it on an individual basis. So that's, why are these things important? Well, these are kind of the building blocks, the elements, the foundation for how you can then think about and attack your skill of negotiating and all the purchases and negotiations you make going forward. We're going to illustrate that now and put it into practice with this negotiation tactic of anchoring. So I gave the example on the written lesson about the internet ad, right, where it said this microphone's worth $260. Here's the regular price, but now it's on sale for $159. So I immediately thought, wow, that's a big difference, right? It's worth $260. I can pay $159 and save $101 and get that extra surplus. But what that shows is that how I just took their input for what the benefit was. I didn't define it myself, but I saw what was written on the screen and I took that. And we don't want to do that. As buyers, we don't want the seller to determine where our benchmark is, where our value is. We need to figure that out ourselves. And the more important, the higher dollar value of that transaction, the more important it is. As sellers, the same way. We don't want the buyer to simply say, oh, well, you're in this category, so you're worth this. We want to explain our value and we want to anchor it ourselves. So understanding what anchoring is, how to work with anchors is extremely important. And that really brings us to the homework. And I want to jump right to that now. So let's take a look at the homework this week. The assignment was to list a few purchases. And for each of those purchases, we want to note what the anchor was, what the anchor price was, and then what the source of the anchor was. And we're going to keep one empty column here and come back to that after we finish our homework. So that's what the homework assignment is. And the first purchase that I thought of was some basketball shoes that I bought the other day. The anchor was $89.99. Now, that's not what I paid for the shoes, but right now we're not talking about what we're paid for. We're talking about the anchor and where that came from. And in this case, it came from a sticker on the shoe which simply said, original price. Okay? So there we've got the purchase, what the anchor was, and the source, the original price. Now, let's look at a few more. I'm going to do my magic trick here. And we'll start with my second one, which was an electric bill. So the electric bill, the anchor So in other words, what I used in my mind for whether that was the right price or not was last month's bill, which was $125. Next thing I thought of was, on the professional side, the company's marketing budget. So a client of mine has a company marketing, well, the anchor for their marketing budget is $8.2 million because that's how much they spent last year. That's last year's budget. So these anchors come from different places. Here's another one, a gallon of gas. What is your anchor? What's the price that you think a gallon of gas should be? In my case, right now, it's $3.30 because that's the price that it goes for across town. Now, I can't pay that in my neighborhood. I have to pay more like $3.65, but I compare that to the anchor price. Another one from the work world, registration for a conference. And this you'll see often. They have a regular rate of $3.99. That's what I put down as my anchor. Now, the rate that I paid was $2.99 because I got the early bird pricing. And then one more, web meeting software. The anchor in my mind is $49 because that's what a competitor charges for a similar web meeting software. Now, keep that column open. That last one I want to talk through for a minute. What we put in that column and what we filled it out with, because the thing we want to think about now, after we've got our purchases and our anchors and where the anchor came from, is what are some alternative sources for those anchors? What could other anchors be? And for example, instead of sneakers, instead of my using the original price as an anchor, I could have used the price for other shoes I had. Or I could have looked online to find some competitive shoes and the prices that they had instead of just using the original price in the store. Let's go to one other, the company marketing. Instead of using last year's budget as the anchor, as the baseline for how much we're going to spend, I could have looked at another comparable company and see what they were doing in terms of their percentage of revenues for their company marketing budget. That's just one example. Conference registration, all right, instead of looking at the early bird pricing or the regular pricing, I could have seen, well, what does another comparable conference cost? Or I could have a pretty different type of anchor where I say, well, what would it cost me to buy some resources and read them myself instead of going to this conference? And would that be a way to compare, or a different option instead of going to the conference? And finally, the web meeting software. This is kind of interesting too, because you can really compare it different ways. If your anchor is simply, well, here's one web meeting software and here's another web meeting software, and they have similar prices, that's one thing. Or you could say, well, I could use Skype, which is free, and there are other products which are free, and so that could be your anchor. Now, on the other side, going up, you could say, well, instead of having the web meeting software, we could have to travel and meet in person, and that's a much higher anchor. So you see there are different types of anchors to compare where your cost is and how you view it and how you frame it, and that's important. Now, that's the homework. So you want to go through the anchors, and then the goal here, and I asked you to do 10 different projects, or 10 different purchases. If you simply do 2 a day, it just takes you 5 days, and that's a work week. So I want you to do 2 a day because you want to be engaged and thinking about, well, this is what I think is a fair price for this, and why is that? Where is that coming from? Did I come up with that anchor myself? Is it based on previous experiences, previous purchases? Is it just something that the salesperson said? Because the power of anchoring is so huge, and I want to tell you why now, or give an example of that with the Beatles and a research project about the Beatles. So this concept of anchoring has been studied by many economists and also many psychologists, because it's sort of an irrational way that people think about numbers and value. And in one experiment, and this is detailed in this book Priceless by William Poundstone. I read the book, I think it's very good. If you're interested in more detail on this, he tells about a researcher that asked subjects about the Beatles, and he said, how many top 10 hits did the Beatles release? Was it more than 100,025 or fewer than 100,025? And the second question was, what's your estimate on how many top 10 records the Beatles released? Now, whether you're a Beatlemaniac like I am, or whether you don't even like the Beatles, you know that they didn't have 100,025 top 10 hits, right? Nobody's had that many. Yet, the amazing thing is, when they couch those questions in that way and put in that outrageous number that has nothing to do with the number of top 10 sales, it actually affected the answers that people gave for the second question. And people consistently gave higher numbers for the answer to how many, what's your estimate on how many top 10 records the Beatles had. Higher numbers when that first number was 100,025 than when the very first number was a low reasonable number, say 3 or 4 or something. So what this demonstrates is that anchoring is so strong in our minds psychologically that even when a number thrown out there has really no relation and no sane connection to the question at hand, it does influence the way we think and the answer we give. It's just fascinating how powerful it is. Now, let me give you another example of this, which is a little more applied, and that is the example of JCPenney's. I mentioned this earlier and alluded to it, if not in the email, perhaps in a note that I sent on the mailing list. And that is about, let's see, in January 2012, JCPenney's announced a new pricing structure that they implemented the following month, in February. They stepped away from their practice of more than 20 years, actually probably much more than that, where they really relied on sales and promotions and discounts and markdowns and coupons. All these ways to bring prices down, and that was the main thing they used to drive their sales. So for example, you go into a Penny's and you'd see a sweater and it would say $49 on it, but then that would be crossed out and it would say $19. And you think, boy, this is a great buy. I'm getting this sweater at 60% off. It's only $19. And you buy it. Well, the CEO of JCPenney's, a new CEO that came from Apple, and he said, you know, I respect our customers a little bit more than this. I'm not going to play these games with them anymore. Instead of all these promotions, we're going to give them fair and square pricing. And they're just going to see the low price, which is the actual value of what they're buying. So that sounds reasonable, sounds respectful. And what happened? The buyers went away in droves. They just left the store, they went to other places to buy their goods, and the strategy just completely failed. In fact, sales at Penny's went down 25% in a year. They dropped 25%. That's disastrous for any company, but especially so in retailing and for a company that's been around for 100 years. So it was a terrible strategy. It didn't work. And I think the main reason it didn't work was because the shoppers really relied on that anchoring to tell themselves that they were getting good value. And it's no surprise when you look at the psychological data, when you look at these examples like Penny's, anchoring is incredibly powerful. But the great news is here that what we're learning in this course, Negotiate Value, is how to understand our benefit, how to do the analysis, so that we don't have to accept these price anchors that sellers throw out there as buyers, or when we're selling something that the buyer pulls out arbitrarily. We can analyze and present an argument for what the value actually is, and that's the way we can negotiate more value out of all of our purchases. So the next module is, as a lead in here, the next module is Know Thy Benefit. We're going to spend at least 4 lessons on going into the depth of what is the benefit, what drives your benefit, how do you define it, and how do you quantify it. So this is going to be a great, very applied and very useful tools in this next module. I hope you'll continue with it. And if also, I want to say, if there's somebody that you think would benefit from this course, this is a great time to pass along an invitation. And if you don't have a discount code for the course, send me a note and I'll get you a discount code so you can get your friends and colleagues taking the course as well. Thanks very much. I'll see you in the next lesson.